Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business Line's State of Economy podcast series. Today, we have with us Sehul Bhatt, the Director Research at Crisil Market Intelligence and Analytics. With more than a decade's experience in industry analysis and company research, Sehul's area of work ranges across macro-micro linkages to sectoral trend analysis in the sectors of energy, commodities, and infrastructure. He also manages cross-sectoral analysis for corporate India on revenues and margins. Besides, his area of interest is tracking financial profile of corporates and their investment cycles. But today, we aim to understand the factors pushing up India's power demand and consumption. In the last couple of years, India's electricity consumption has grown by more than 7 to 8% on an annual basis. And in the current financial year, that is 2024-25, the demand rode past almost all government projections led by an inclement weather. To that effect, 2024 has been an exceptional year in terms of weather-related energy consumption, with April-June being marked by sweltering temperatures coupled with long and intense heat waves across North India, leading to a higher requirement of cooling. Even the Power Ministry has revised its peak power demand upwards to 458 gigawatts by 2032 from the earlier estimate of 384 gigawatts. Now, in the backdrop of these developments, we aim to leverage Sehul's deep insights in the energy sector to understand the impact of weather and other factors on India's power consumption. So without much ado, welcome Sehul.
Thank you.
And Sehul, even as we speak today, Delhi's weather is very sultry, which is driving up demand for cooling. So the first question that comes here is, what are your thoughts on the power consumption in the last couple of years and the factors, pushing them up?
So if you look at long-term trends, there is a strong correlation between GDP growth and power demand growth that we have observed. In fact, between fiscal 2020 and 2024, power demand growth was marginally higher than the GDP growth rate. And not just the overall macro scenario, but factors such as temperature increase, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, manufacturing pace, agricultural activities, increasing consumer durable penetration, and obviously the changing consumption patterns. All of this put together influence the overall power demand. We think that of all of these factors, temperature is very crucial, and at least in the recent years, the factor which has been creating variation in power demand for the last couple of years and predominantly over the last few months specifically. Temperature, in fact, if you observe the long period average, which we track very closely, last calendar year, the number was 0.65 degrees Celsius compared to a long period average number. And this year, in fact, it is even higher during the summer months. Now, because of all of these, power demand increased substantially, almost to the extent of 12% on year basis during April and in the month of May this year compared to the last year. However, if you observe recent data, which is for the month of August and September, we have seen demand trend reversing. If you see data for August, the power demand has declined by 5%. As we saw a country receiving excess rainfall, specifically around 7% during the month of August. And YTD data, which is 1st September to 23rd September data, indicates that power demand is lower by 2% on year, again due to a reduced temperature. So I think if you look at base demand or a peak demand, it is getting influenced because of a temperature variation over the last few months.
Right. So, Mehul, how would you, describe the efforts the government has made in, meeting this power demand last year and this year? Do you see government becoming more aggressive? Because what we see is that the government this year was quite aggressive. In fact, the coal ministry had put in a whole lot of effort to make available more coal at power plant sites. How would you look at, government's efforts in the last 2 years, in meeting this consumption?
No, I completely agree. I think we see a well-calibrated approach by the government to ensure power demand is addressed with minimum instances of deficit scenario. So as you rightly mentioned, the government's decision to allow coal blending before the summer month, definitely it has worked. In March, if you recall, this year, the Power Ministry advised all the coal-fired thermal plants to continue importing coals at 6% for blending purpose. And that was for the preparation for peak demand season, which usually is also observed during the month of summer times. Similarly, we saw Ministry of Power taking measures to operationalize gas power plants during summer electricity demand surge. So I think we see all of these measures have helped us during summer months, specifically in this calendar year.
Right, and I remember when you just was mentioning about how power demand was really high during the April June time, and then it tapered during August and September, and August has thrown up really interesting numbers. I just wanted to share a couple of them. If you look at the coal production and dispatch, surprisingly, in about 2 years, this was the first time that coal production and dispatch went down in August. In fact, besides that, diesel consumption also went down to almost a 15-month low. And the reasons we were told is that there was fairly widespread rains across northwestern India, eastern India, which had impacted. So, if we look at, and here is that the point that I wanted to bring in again, to look at it in a much larger perspective, weather is making temperatures rise north, and then suddenly in a month's time they start plummeting towards the southern side. So how are you companies trying to look at this event, to look at these, if I can call them weather anomalies? How are companies, sectors, rating agencies looking at such events and their impact on revenues, finances, consumption?
Right. So over the last 5 years, we have seen that every year the median temperature has been higher compared to the previous year. That means that every year in the summer season, we end up consuming more power. Let's take an example of peak demand. Yeah. Now, if you observe peak electricity demand in India, it has grown to almost 243 gigawatt in fiscal 24. And if you look at last 6 years, average growth, it is close to 6.8%. There is also a change of pattern, specifically in terms of the occurrence of peak demand in a particular month. Now, prior to the pandemic, electricity demand in India usually peaked in the month of August and September, mostly covering the monsoon season. Now, this spike in peak demand was primarily due to an increase in domestic as well as commercial load, mainly obviously space cooling load, which was required due to high humidity conditions. However, during post-pandemic years, annual peak demand occurred in the summer season, which is April to July, due to extreme heat wave conditions. Peak demand last year, as I mentioned, was close to 243 gigawatt in fiscal 24 during September. Again, the reason for here could be attributed to an increase in cooling demand because of intense summers that we had in some of the regions. Now, how some of the companies are coping up with this? Obviously, one will be the kind of preparation they will have to ensure for ensuring the power is available to grid at that point of time. Second, we see with evolving demand pattern, which is not now specific to a particular month, as we spoke in the previous point. The unique business models are also evolving with regards to tendering. So RTC, which is round the clock, then a peak demand kind of an addressal, hybrid mode, FDRE. All of these are the modes which we are seeing evolving, where very specific expectation will be set up by the consuming segment or CNI segment as far as the expectation of load is given to the bidding authority, or for that matter to a power generation plant. So I think we see all of that evolving over the last few quarters, and that's likely to continue as far as the trend for business model is concerned in future as well.
And just one small supplementary question, something which we also noticed last year and this year. During the solar hours, the demand has been higher, but last year and this year, the evening hours also, we have seen power demand rising, and the heat and humidity has been for a longer duration in the night. And usually with weathers, what we understood was that, in the night, the temperatures would cool down a bit. But this time we did witness several instances where, the nighttime temperatures were also above 38 degrees Celsius with a humidity index of roughly 40-45%, which this pushes for more demand for cooling. So these, and as you rightly said, that the government itself is pushing for FDRE, firm and dispatchable RE or round the clock. in the short term, do you think we'll get? I don't. We think that it will be a little challenging for the government to push in more FDRE or RTC, renewable energy, in the evening hours. This how do you think? Do you think it will take short to medium term for FDRE and RTC power to be available in the grid?
Right. So I think will require this to be done in a calibrated manner, given the current state where, having said that, the focus on renewable continues to be topmost. We need to take into account the fact that coal continues to be a backbone of our supply today, be it in terms of capacity or be it in terms of generation. Which means that if we have to focus more on incremental capacity coming in from RE sources, which eventually will also require us to have a very strong dependency on storage. So all the business model, if you the points that you spoke of, be it hybrid, RTC or FDRE, all of them have a very high dependency or have equally important aspect of storage coming into the picture, which we believe that will take some time as far as the BESS system is concerned in terms of good penetration within the overall generation mix. Hence, on an immediate basis, I think while these models are evolving, will they have a very high contribution in terms of overall generation? The answer is no. But yes, they are the ones who are going to define the way in which the bidding activities will pan out, especially on the utility scale or on the CNI segment. And that's where we see traction continuing over a medium term.
So, just taking your last points that you raised about the medium-term projections, say, as you would be aware that globally, that this current financial year, fiscal 25 and fiscal 26, global agencies are quite optimistic about India's economic growth across from OPEC to JP Morgan. Everyone talks about it. And as India grows, its power consumption and demand will also grow. How do you you had research at Crisil, and I'm pretty sure there are several compelling narratives that you hear almost every day. How are you guys looking at these projections, and how India's demand consumption will behave in the next 2 years?
Okay. So we project power demand at almost 7% growth in the current fiscal. Prime reason, especially because of the growth that we spoke for the month of August and April and May, was owing to the weather-related events, including severe and prolonged heat waves that occurred in the first quarter, as well as insufficient rainfall that we had in the month of July. Also supporting demand is a strong economic activity. Our own in-house estimation indicates that this year India's GDP will be somewhere around 6.8%. And with this in the FY25 perspective, we see a long-term demand growth for power to be at 6 to 7% CAGR for the next 5 years. Now, while this is more from a demand point of view, keeping in mind the pace at which we need to have generation also to be in sync, we see that overall the kind of a growth rate that we need for capacity addition is likely to be the tune of 10% CAGR over the next 5 years. Now, the pace of capacity growth will be slightly higher compared to the demand growth, essentially with the fact that more addition, or in fact, large scale of addition is likely to happen into the renewable space, where typically the non-fossil PLFs are lower compared to the coal ones. And hence, to keep up with the pace in terms of generation, I think the supply addition has to be at a higher quantum. Also, we believe that despite increasing focus of RE sources, coal will continue to remain a critical source for electricity generation in India, and this is likely to continue at least for the medium term.
So, without taking much time, the last question that several of our viewers ask about it is: are government efforts enough to support this demand and this consumption which is rising? Because the government has already said, as we are aware, that 80 gigawatts of capacity, coal-fired capacity, would be required by 2032 to manage the grid and provide support. And of that, almost more than half has already been, awarded. And in this fiscal 25, we expect roughly 12 to 14 gigawatts of thermal capacity to come online. So, important question from our viewers: are the efforts enough? If not, what do you think is required at this point? Because, April is again less than 6 months away. And as we speak, by next month, government will again gear up to meet those coal supply mandates and other things. So the question to you: are efforts enough? What more is needed?
Right. So let's look at it more from a medium to long-term perspective, and let's look at it more from a macro lens first. Power sector, as we all agree, has evolved significantly over the past few years in terms of many aspects. One, if you look at the focus on renewable, with the government's target of Panchamrit mission, we are already seeing traction in terms of installed capacity addition happening in terms of RE space, be it solar or wind. We also see efforts and very strong momentum on tendering activity. We are also seeing a good support into the allied infrastructure, which is a transmission as well as discom side. On top of that, to ensure that all of these missions are actually addressed in terms of backward integration, there is also a traction which is seen in terms of PLI for photovoltaic sale or battery manufacturing. Now, while all of these are actions which are already been there, or the action has been there on ground, we see some of more policy perspective coming in to ensure that the pace continues over the medium term. We hence believe that government or policymakers will have very strong view coming in terms of green taxonomy, the carbon market development that could come up, as well as more intervention that could come in terms of viability gap funding, especially to ensure that new technologies such as offshore wind that was recently announced or battery storage system, all of those are incentivized, and there is a use case scenario which is a commercial viable option there over the next 2 to 3 years timeline. So I think these are more actions which I'm sure industry would look forward to hearing more from a regulator or policymakers perspective.
And one supplementary, Mehul, thermal is important, but how crucial is thermal till 2030, 32 to manage the grid? Right now, we started having problems with more in RE going into the grid and balancing issues. A couple of issues had come during uh, May and June. We did face some power outages because of this, specifically around Rajasthan and Gujarat. How important will be thermal in this all journey? Because we're going for greening of the environment, but the base of that is still on thermal. So how important thermal would be? Last question.
We see that thermal today continues to be the core element of overall generation, and the importance of thermal is likely to continue in 2030 as well. In fact, our estimates suggest that even by 2030, despite all the incremental or large share of incremental addition on the capacity continue on the renewable space led by solar and wind, the contribution of thermal, especially led by coal, is likely to remain almost half in terms of generation even by 2030. So our in-house view is that even by 2030, your half of the generation will still be driven by thermal and hence coal. So dependency on coal, especially as even the ministry has been indicating in various forums and various releases, that despite all efforts in terms of incremental capacities continuing towards non-fossil fuel, coal and hence thermal is likely to stay a strong contributor to overall generation even over the next 5-7 years period.
A brilliant summing up, Sehul, that renewable is rising, but coal is going to be stay around. With that, thank you so much, Sehul, for sparing time and breaking down all complicated, finer economic and practical nuances for our listeners. Thank you so much for joining our podcast series. Have a good day.
Thank you.